All right. So we talked about risk registers and the need for documentation. The next step, as we can see in this life cycle, is now to kind of respond to the risk, right? Okay, getting into that. I completely kind of feel a bit thrown off in terms of 2 places. So our objective and the overview, right? Basically, the goal here is for management to kind of make a decision, and it's going to be an information based, right? So based on the information that we provide the management, or rather based on the information that the management is able to gather during the risk identification, as well as the risk assessment, management will come up with how to approach the risk mitigation as well as the risk response, depending on which one you're talking about. So the objective will be to kind of determine the response options and basically evaluate their kind of effectiveness, as well as how managing the risk is in alignment with the business objectives, right? So it's not just to respond, but also making sure that the response we are doing is in alignment with the business objectives, right? And in a good organization, or rather I would say a good risk management approach will be for management to be able to justify the risk response decision, right? So for every single decision that management is going to take to say, this is how we're going to respond to this risk, there has to be some form of justification that is in alignment with the business objectives. So just because you're the CISO, you shouldn't just wake up and say, this is how we're doing it, but rather this is the approach we're going to take to control, or apply a control, or at least respond to the risk, because it's going to enable the business in a certain aspect, right? And we have also discussed how important it is to really identify, not just in alignment with the business, but by identifying, if we take this approach, how does it add value, right? How does it contribute to the business in entirety? So at the very least, that risk response should always kind of strike a balance between protecting the business objectives and also adding a value to the business. But then one thing is always important, ensuring that it doesn't impede on operation. This is something you find a lot of us coming from the IT shop are fond of doing. We apply so many controls that we tend to forget that part of operations, right? Where making the job easy on our colleagues is also as vital and as important. What's the point of having our colleagues spend 30 hours just to send an email because we have put so many controls? At the end of the day, if it doesn't make them efficient and it doesn't provide an easy way of operation, then it's also impeding on the entire business operations, right? So striking that balance is always quite important, as we mentioned. Now, we also just high level touch upon, it is very, very important to align the risk response with the business objective. Same thing, right? Management must always consider that the best response. Best response, there is no, we can't say, okay, we are mitigating all risk. No, absolutely not. You cannot respond to all risk, but we can always identify the best response, right? We have to develop an action plan. We touch a little bit on risk register and POAM and all of those things. So beyond saying, oh, this risk is currently in existence and this, we just need to address it, but rather let's build up an action plan. How are we coming up to basically address that, right? How are we going to respond to it? For those on the government side, we are very familiar with POAM, right? That is where plan of action and milestone comes into the picture. For the commercial sector, we have risk registers. Depends on which framework or standard one is implementing, the name can change. But basically, it is that part where we are tracking as well as identifying the objectives as well as the action plan, including dates, the milestone of how we are going to respond. Then obviously we need to meet compliance requirement and the business goal. Meeting the compliance requirement, it's a common thing that everybody these days associate kind of entire risk management. Everyone tends to associate, what's going on? That's on me. I'm trying to pick a pen. So everyone is associating the entire risk management with compliance requirements, and we tend to forget that business goal, right? That value part that I always love to say, the need to add value. So I will absolutely love and advise any risk professional beyond just compliance requirement. How are our actions adding value? And yeah, having compliance, satisfying compliance in itself does add value to the business. It does allow the business to, depending on how you see it, right? If we are out of compliance, then maybe the business stops. So we have to be in compliance to ensure that the business runs. Those are all kind of justification and approach we need to take. Quick pulse check here. I do see Harry raising his hand, right? Am I correct? Go ahead, Harry.
Yeah, yes, sir. So I think I'm following you on the compliance requirement versus business goal. And it seems like what's happening now is the audit world is really translating the value, right? So compliance is going to an audit framework that really pursues the value that the business is pursuing. So I thought I'd just mention that. Over.
100% agree. That's basically it. Honestly, as you said, meeting compliance in itself is what it might not be the business objective and the mission, so you might not see it in the business mission statement or the business goal, but then meeting compliance is an enabler, right? Especially in strict industries, like you take, for example, HIPAA. Good luck trying to have any patient's record and not being in HIPAA compliance, or good luck trying to be a cut provider and not meeting PCI DSS, right? So all of those are basically enablers as well. It's just that the mindset these days, as Harry also mentioned, honestly, everybody thinks of security, everybody thinks of compliance, regulation, whatsoever. We just think like, this is just that bottleneck that the government put in place or certain industry put in place for us to meet. And if we don't meet it, we are just not gonna move forward as such. Let's just do what we can, right? I disagree with that, but some see it that way. The reason why, and actually I was about to have a pulse check, but the reason why I'm saying I disagree, it's not because it is not true. It is just that if one has that mindset, it makes it super, super hard to convince those stakeholders into seeing the value, into us getting a budget and all of those things. All right, so Harry, I'm not sure if you're raising your hand again or is the previous one. If you are raising again, please go for it.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to kind of, we don't want your hands getting tired. So.
Gotcha.
Any question on this? None? Great. Okay. So if we decide to respond to risk at a very high level, and I'm looking for a volunteer, feel free to just use the chat without removing yourself. What are some options that we have? I know we all have the deck, right? But I'm begging you, do not comment on anyone if you do not know what that means. Like, don't tell me risk acceptance just because you already have the deck. Seriously, tell me risk acceptance because you know what that means. So, anyone, what options do we have relating to that? How to respond to risk? Feel free to use the chat.
Transfer.
I'm sorry?
So we can transfer the risk?
Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean for us to transfer the risk?
Example would be insurance, offload to somebody else, let them absorb the risk.
Okay, I agree with that. Thanks for keeping it concise. Definitely agree. Anyone?
Accept the
You can
risk.
accept.
Yep, agreed. I had two people. I'm not sure who spoke, but transfer, mitigate, avoidance, and acceptance. Thanks, Trojan. The two that also said accept, 100% agree. So let's go over each single one at a very high level and discuss it, right? So to accept the risk is to knowingly acknowledge and basically say, yes, I'm willing to accept this, right? That is, I'm willing to take no action to reduce the risk. I'm willing to just consume it, right, without doing anything. And taking no action to reduce the risk is basically risk acceptance. It is a management decision, and it must always be driven by risk acceptance and tolerance level, right? So that includes doing nothing to protect like the vulnerability of the system or accepting the outcome of its exploitation, right? Deny the risk. I agree with that. I mean, one could say that risk acceptance is mostly valid when a particular function does not justify kind of the cost or the value of whatever it is we are protecting. So let me give an example. What if you do not have any sensitive information or whatsoever, you just buy a $200 laptop, right? Truthfully, cumulatively, including all the information within that device, like the laptop whatsoever, is not up to $200 to you. And you do not plan on having any information whatsoever worth more than $200 on that device. So at the end of the day, if you had to sit down and think, if you lose this device, you only lose $200 on the device itself. Okay, that's fine. No data, nothing. As such, you also realize like, I do not have an antivirus on the system, and I keep going on the internet. I keep whatsoever. There's no single anti-malware protection or any malware protection like an anti-malware or whatsoever on this device. But for me to install that is going to cost me $400. Yeah, I think it's fair to say one can accept that risk, right? Because the entire value of the asset in itself is like $200. We do not have any intention of storing anything more than $200 or whatsoever on the device. I guess so, but there is another thing that could instantly change that justification without opening the floor. If you can come up with a justification by saying like, listen, if an antivirus gets on this device, it's going to take me 1 hour to address that. And honestly speaking, 1 hour of my time is not worth 500. Like 1 hour of my time is worth more than $700 or even $1,000. As such, I'm willing to spend $300 to put an antivirus and bring that asset value to $500, because if any virus gets on this device, taking any action upon it to bring it back to its current state is going to cost me 1 hour, and 1 hour of my time is almost $1,000. And I'm also unwilling to just let the device go. So yeah, that could be a justification. As such, if you are to put the value of the device in itself, your 1 hour, 1,000, that is the fix, as well as the device, it's 200, then yeah, maybe you can justify it that way. Does anyone have any question on this? Does it make sense? All right. Next, mitigation. This is what I was saying earlier. Even though the chapter has a title called risk mitigation, but now we have it one as an option for risk response. So please be careful when reading that of the ISACA book, because risk mitigation, they are now presenting it as the whole chapter title, what synonymous with like a response, but here we are having risk mitigation as one of the options for risk response, right? So I will highly, highly, highly recommend you look at the context, you understand the scenario when you come across questions that are touching upon this, because it's now ISACA talking about oh, responding to the risk as risk mitigation, or is ISACA talking about risk mitigation as one of the options of risk response, right? So if you see the question there in any of either the quiz or you're taking the test and you see risk mitigation and you go for it because you know it as one of the options when it comes to responding to risk, but then you see like, maybe in that context, ISACA is looking at it from a grand scheme of things as risk mitigation means risk response. Please don't come after me. It's ISACA's fault. It's kind of like just basically garbage in, garbage out. But yeah, just keep that in mind, okay? All right, anybody want to volunteer and kind of tell us what does risk mitigation mean in this context? Please feel free to unmute yourself and just take a minute or so to kind of touch upon it. Anybody?
It's putting controls in place to reduce the effects of the vulnerabilities, like if somebody compromises the system.
Okay, okay, I agree with that. Just for, as a wearing the risk professional hat, I wouldn't use the word vulnerability. I would say more like reducing the risk, right, in itself. Since vulnerability is just one element of risk, we need the likelihood and whatsoever for it to evolve into risk. So reducing the vulnerability alone doesn't translate into that. But yes, I agree with you on that. Anyone that wants to kind of quickly add or no? Okay, so it's basically, I'm not sure who spoke, is it Stephanie? But yeah.
This is John Holm, but I was just going to say that it could also include eliminating the threat, right, in terms of the risk response.
I'm sorry, what? I have two people talking. I'm sorry.
Yes, it could also include eliminating the threat as a part of the risk response.
Okay. Yes. So I initially skipped a hard bit when I had eliminate because I thought you were going to say eliminate the risk. I will say like, going to be difficult to eliminate risk. But yes, it could be eliminating the threat. Absolutely. One methodology of responding to risk as part of risk mitigation is ensuring that the threat is no longer there, right? So we always talk about Kali. You move away from Kali as such and move to Indiana, right in the middle of nowhere. And we know that the radius of that earthquake or whatsoever everybody keeps talking about that's going to happen 100 years from now is definitely not going to reach to Indiana. As such, one could say, yeah, you have mitigated the risk by basically eliminating it because you really eliminate that threat of that applies to you. Moving to Indiana means there is no longer threat of earthquake, right? You might have other threats that are applicable to Indiana, that environment, but definitely not that. So yeah, I agree with it.
Professor, isn't that kind of considered,
yeah?
sorry, isn't that also considered like risk avoidance?
Yeah, actually, yes. The example I just gave is definitely more towards risk avoidance by avoiding it completely, not mitigation. So yeah, thank you for calling me out on that. Absolutely agree. That will be more into that avoidance by moving away, not necessarily applying a control. Since if you move Cali to Indiana, you are not applying a control, but rather avoiding it. You are 100% correct. I'm wrong on that. Thank you. Does everybody understand this part? The confusion, what I just created right now, and what I'm not sure who spoke, but the correction I just received?
That was
So
done.
basically it was the example. Yeah, basically it was the example that I gave with Cali and moving to Indiana. That is not a mitigation, since mitigation involves applying a control. And by moving away, you are not applying a control, but rather you are avoiding the risk. So yeah, that is absolutely a good example for risk avoidance, not a good one for mitigation. Mitigation will have to involve a decision to apply a control, right, to mitigate it, or basically to reduce the risk, either through the implementation of a control, or it could be a new control, or improving an existing control, but definitely not running away from Cali to Indiana. So it's going to involve an attempt to either reduce the risk surface, the impact of the attack, since we are talking about like Kali and that, then it will involve what can we put in place to ensure that if that happens, we are still, the impact is going to be very minimized when it comes to us. Maybe building some long story buildings that means even if the water comes into the picture, we're still above, right? I don't know, but yeah, that's certainly true. And mitigation plans, there are certain mitigation plans. In this scenario, it could be like incident response, disaster recovery. The other one is business continuity, right? So we'll have all of those plans in place as well if something were to happen, but yes. Okay, this brings us to the next one, risk avoidance or termination sometimes. I think the book calls it termination. For those of you that read the book, right? Did you come across any word like termination in there? It's kind of odd, but yeah, the book has that definition inside it as well. But it basically applies to a risk that one could say like the risk is too large to accept, or there are really no cost-effective way of doing things. As such, the organization is trying to avoid it, moving completely away from it, right? And seeking an alternative to that. Any questions on this? Okay, then the last one I believe is risk transfer. Someone touched upon this earlier, high level, but risk transfer involves kind of sharing the risk. Think of just your insurance basically. You see a risk, you don't want to address it or respond to it directly by either accepting, mitigating, or avoiding, so you transfer that to someone else, right? Or rather, you share that responsibility. Basically, it's a strategy, right, to kind of shift the risk away from yourself to another either organization. It could also be some sort of a joint venture where two organizations will come together to share it because they share a similar kind of risk. An example of that is, can please everybody go on mute? An example will be, yeah, cyber insurance, definitely Joshua is an example. But yeah, let's say two organizations are facing a similar kind of risk. They can all agree to like build maybe another data center, just one data center, and just share it as their disaster recovery data center, right? If something is that hit one person, one organization, they can instantly switch to that, and they are now sharing the risk as well as the cost-effective benefits are being shared, right? Okay. So how do you decide which response methodology, or rather which of the response option is the best for you? That brings us to risk response analysis and technique. So one option, when it comes to the risk response factors, priority of risk. We touched upon this earlier, right? Once you identify a risk, you assess the risk, you then put some ranking to the risk. Low, moderate, high, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way, whatever ranking you want to take, or say 100. Just something that basically ranks the risk and prioritize the risk, right? Again, ranking the risk doesn't necessarily mean the high risk should always be the first to be responded to. It depends, right? You can identify a risk as a high risk, but then when it comes to your response, certain thing might come into the picture, maybe cost. You realize like, okay, if you try to take on that big risk that you identify as a high risk right now, you might not get, you might not be able to conquer it. So as such, you're going to focus on the low hanging fruits because they will provide you with more value, right? Or because maybe you don't have the controls in place or ways to actually respond to the high one, right? As such, you are going to implement controls that are available, right? Availability of control comes in different forms. Technology, for example, we have tools in place that have been in existence for forever. As such, there are different ways to put controls in place, right? Or we even have abundant availability of controls. Or maybe a brand new technology will come into the picture that nobody knows it, and as such, it presents different type of risk, and we don't even have an idea of how should we approach these controls. Quick example, earlier we had deepfakes. That is certainly one methodology, right? Basically, there are several analysis techniques. As we mentioned, these are all. Another one, cost. Cost could be operational cost of the control or impact on business operations. It could be actually training cost. Maybe you don't have the right staff that will be able to manage the control or maintain the control once you implement it. As such, you need to hire. A lot of things comes into the picture, right? But then how do we do the analysis? When it comes to business side of things, we will take either a cost-benefit analysis or a return on investment, right? If we're talking about now the profit, right? Cost-benefit analysis, we touch upon this as well, but it's just a methodology, an analysis approach that is used to justify the expense, right? Associated with the implementation, I guess, of the control. So it will involve considering the entire cost, not just how much is it going to cost us to implement the control, but rather looking at the control cost from its entire life cycle. That is, you buy or part of that acquisition process, you then install the control, now you have to maintain it. If there are operations, if there are licensing, do you need to train people? Do you need to decommission it after a certain time? All of those are considered the cost of the control. If you put all of those together and then look at it from a business perspective, would you have any value in that? Because cycling back to the example I gave with the laptop earlier, if we are just to factor the cost of the device, then one will say that there's, from the cost-benefit analysis, definitely there will be no value in putting $1,000 antivirus software in a 200 watt of device, including the data and everything that is inside is just going to be valued at 200. Then yeah, absolutely no point putting $1,000 antivirus. But then if you take the different approach of how much time is it going to take you to actually fix it if the risk is to happen, then now we are talking about if your hourly value, if you see it from an hourly perspective, if your hourly value outweighs the pricing that is considered for the control, right? That's one. When we talk about the return on investment, that is just also to justify the investment that we are going to do on the new tool, the control, on whatsoever, to see if it is really worth it, right? If there are any savings. If we put in this $1,000 into this control, are we going to gain more profit later on, or is that considered basically a loss? Why go into a loss before you even apply it if you can know, right? I don't think I think there will be no organization will go through something knowing that it's going to be a 100% loss, even if it means from the monetary perspective it's a loss. Chances are the organization is also looking for something, right? It could be reputation, it could be you name it, right? Adding value to business operations. So yeah, it doesn't translate to profit directly in hard-earned cash, but maybe it improves the employee well-being. So maybe it's worth it. A lot of things. Any question on this part before I move forward? Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay.
So I'd like to share a comment, if I could, on the topic of cost-benefit analysis. I'm familiar with the work of two professors at the University of Maryland Smith Business School, Professor Larry Gordon and Marty Lieb, who I would say are among the foremost experts, if you will, on the topic of the economics of cybersecurity. And they've actually developed a very useful investment model for cybersecurity. In fact, you can go find an animation of it on YouTube. It's called the Gordon Lieb model. for cybersecurity investment. And it basically implements the principles that you're talking about here, Professor, which is, you look at the cost, you look at the benefits, you look at the return on investment of whatever you're going to do to determine whether it's worth it. And it's a very practical approach, in fact, but I think in many areas quite effective when you can get down to a cost level of decision making.
Agreed 100%, Harry. Truly appreciate that addition. Can you please help us? You mentioned they have a tool or something. Can you add it to the chat so people can kind of have an insight into it?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat window. But it's called the Gordon Lieb model for cybersecurity investment, and it's and of course they've written 20 years worth of analytical research at the Smith Business School on this, and so they really have carved out a very strong understanding and position in the work that they do. So, but I'll put it in the chat window, okay?
Great, thank you so much. That's absolutely that will be helpful. That's great to hear. And one of my takeaway from here now is I'm talking to my fellow technical folks. As we were talking during the beginning of the class, in as much as we're talking about cyber, and we have cybersecurity, and us technical people keep thinking like, yeah, this is our domain whatsoever, we cannot remove the business side of things, right? Most businesses, especially the commercial sector, are in the business of making profit. So we cannot remove that. So we might be very technical and technical savvy, but it doesn't translate into, honestly, leadership position, or rather even leadership growth, where the organization will start seeing you as someone who adds value from that leadership perspective, unless we are able to think of it from how is our action, like the cybersecurity stuff we're doing, really contributing to the organization, or saving the organization money, or adding more profit, right? And I will keep stressing this out. Unless we are able to, for us technical people, unless we are able to really align our reasoning with that perspective of adding value and like what is profit, what is ensuring there's less expense, all of those things, unless we're able to do that, we will always have some challenge when it comes to interacting with stakeholders. That's just it. Stakeholders should not be the ones learning about IT or cybersecurity in depth, like understanding the technical know-how. No, absolutely not. IT should be the one to understand how the tool and our processes are contributing to the business. If anyone objects to that, please let me know. I honestly am willing to have this conversation in depth. Anyone have any story or really experience around how that IT versus the business side of IT really makes a difference when it comes to interacting with stakeholders and leadership? Anyone? Please share. Because there are a lot of people in this class with a lot of experience. I just happen to be on the other side where I'm the instructor, but other than that, there are a lot of people with way more experience than I do in this class. That I know. So please share with us. If anybody has any. I think it adds value to the class. So please, anyone?
What was the question again?
Oh, the question is if anyone have that kind of example of any challenges in the face at the organization between doing things from an IT perspective only and how adding that business side of things made a difference. If there is none, we can move forward to the class.
So this is Josh Scarpino. So I used to be an information security officer of a pretty large mortgage company. And I know one of the challenges that I always balanced between was, technical implementation on the security side, running the security program, and then actually correlating how that translates to the board. And a lot of times the board it's hard to justify, when you first come in and there's no security program, no foundation, no nothing, and you're trying to explain that, trying to build that trust and get them to understand that, we're building this program and setting the expectations on why you're investing all this into the program for, security awareness. And even though it's going to meet regulatory requirements, how else is it going to benefit the organization? That's always a constant challenge. And I know me personally, having both sides of the experience, it helped, in the business units, translating the technical jargon into what that's going to help meet strategic goals, to bridge between like the regulatory requirements for how we can align business objectives along with the regulatory goals for each of the independent states and deliverables for profitability, obviously. So is that what you were talking about?
That's absolutely. Yep, that's exactly what I was talking about. And I think it's a common thing, honestly. It's a common thing for all of us as we are kind of growing up and whatsoever, interacting with the stakeholders that are only understanding things from a business angle. It's always a challenge at that early stages to really translate it into value, especially you mentioned something very important, that trust part, right? And building that trust involves them knowing that, yes, this person is also thinking from the business side of things, not just the IT. But yeah, thanks a lot for sharing. That's exactly what I was asking for. Okay, so now that we touched on that response, right, and we said one method is to improve existing controls and another is to kind of have a new control, right? Keep in mind that having a new control or actually even updating an existing control could also present its own challenges, right? It could come with certain vulnerabilities. So just an example here, we have maybe a lock. If we decide to install a new lock, that new lock could keep people up. That's an example. Another thing is how many of us have actually run an update, maybe a security update only for it to come with new challenge, right? Or new vulnerabilities. Those are all things to consider in as much as we have existing vulnerabilities and we are all rushing to respond to it, and then we say, okay, let's buy this, let's do this. We should constantly factor what other vulnerabilities will come along with the new control or updating the existing control, right? Basically, it is just very important to keep that in mind, right? A new control may introduce new vulnerabilities, or even an existing control that is being updated may also present new vulnerabilities. So it is always important to have a plan on how our actions are going to really impact everything. And I said everything because as we are doing it, everything has a scope, but we have to see it from the entire business side of things, not just limited to our scope. All right. We touch upon the need to develop a risk action plan. This is that we're slowly getting to the part where the class is going to be way more boring for everybody because most of the chunk of everything has been touched either at a very high level or you kind of have an idea on what that is. Because as I mentioned, the risk management process is not a linear process. Don't expect it to be ABC, but rather you go from A, B, C, and come back to B again, and then re-strategize on how to get to C and D, right? So we'll keep touching upon things in different places. So yeah, developing a risk action plan. For those of us in the government, what does this look like? What document like do we have? I think we have been mentioning it, right? What document do we tend to have within the government side of things that captures this?
Poem.
Yep, poems. That's absolutely true. Is there anybody who doesn't understand the need to develop a risk action plan? Okay, The book will keep calling it risk register, because it's just a register containing all the risk and that have been identified, including details around how we are responding as well as the action plans, right? Action plans go in detail at a granular level, including what is the strategy. As you can see, the minute we start talking about the time frame and whatsoever, then definitely we are now seeing it at a granular level, right? Again, as a risk professional, deciding on the time frame to address the risk is not only dependent upon the control in itself, or rather the risk in itself, from that perspective of, oh, this is hard, so it's going to take us a while, or this is easy, we're just going to do it. No, sometimes there are parts that will actually involve maybe our competitors, right? Who is early to market, right? Who, when is the right time for us to do it? Because if we do it earlier, then it might not be as effective, right? Maybe we're anticipating a flood. Should we put it 3 years before the flood? Or should we wait till it's the right time? Maybe when our alarms and signals have started buzzing, then we put those controls in place because it's going to be more effective. So all of those things come into the picture, right? When is the right time for what? That kind of touches a little bit on that project management, because addressing the risk in itself is a project. And a lot of people do not see it as a project, but truthfully, addressing a risk should be a project in itself, right? Yeah, maybe a mini project, a small project, but it should involve all of those things that ensures we are successful in addressing the risk. It could be budgeting issues that result into the time frame or the strategy in itself. It could be that we are not at a place to actually do it entirely as we want. As such, we are starting just small in chunks. So a lot of things, right? The review as well as tools and techniques, right? So let's take a look at, like, from the business review process, right? Obviously, document and evaluate the current business process. We have to start with that. We cannot just say, yeah, we are just responding to the risk without evaluating the current business processes, because evaluating the current business process is what means by aligning with the business goals, right? It also involves that ensuring the effectiveness and the efficiency of the organization, right, in meeting that business goals and the objectives. The review steps could involve what? Things like identifying what are the critical processes, right? What are the supply chain and services? Let me give a quick example. Let's say we are in a business that involves delivery, right? And part of our business objective is to really send or maybe ship out products, maybe 1,000 products in a day. And due to the nature of our business, the best time to ship those products, the best method of shipping those products as well as taking them from one place to another is using trucks. Those trucks only go out at night, late night, when there are less vehicles. It could be just basically at night. Then we identify that, and we are like, okay, that's cool. We already fleshed that out and whatsoever. But then now we have another security personnel who came into the picture with their security mindset. And they realized, like, wait, what? The entire business has closed. And then we have this gate still open. It's like 11 a.m. at night. Without the knowledge of, oh, we have trucks that need to come and be loaded at this hour, that person just decides to close the gate and just go home. Yeah, that is definitely applying a control without looking into the business processes. Because what that means is we are now unable to load the trucks at the hour that they need to be loaded, right? So all of those kind of things, just because one identifies a vulnerability and one instantly has an awareness of the control that needs to be applied, does not mean that it is the right control, because we have to make sure it aligns with the business process. And guess what? It's something we do a lot. This is that part where your experience is very valuable, but transferring it from one organization to another is not applicable, right? You cannot just say, oh, this is how we do it in this business. As such, I'm just going to transfer that process into here. No. This new business you're in might actually have a completely separate process and way of doing things. Okay. It could also mean documenting the current process, right? What are the current issues and problems with the business? What is actually the baseline? That's another good one. What does the organization consider as the baseline of its security standards, right? If the organization is at a comfortable stage where its tolerance is to this level, going beyond that might not be bad, but it might be now at a point where there is no ROI, right? There is no return on investment. We might be expensing more than necessary to the business. An example is if a business provides mobile phones to their employees and they identify that the value of that phone is just to make calls and that's it. No need for anything. There is no risk whatsoever. And they decide to give their employees like the iPhone 7 or so. Now, just because we can afford to buy iPhone 10 does not mean we should buy it, because if the iPhone 7 still make calls and there is no risk associated with like outdated software or whatsoever, we still feel like there is no vulnerabilities or concerns with using the old devices does not mean that we should update to the new ones unless it's going to add value or unless there will be a return on investment. Keep in mind, return investment could be the happiness and well-being of employees. Maybe I hate that fact that I need to put only a passcode to unlock an iPhone 7. Maybe with the new iPhone, I can now use my face, so it optimizes things that makes me happy. That's value to a business if the business sees it that way. All right. Any question on this? Great. Next, we can talk about identifying potential changes, right? So again, similar to those things, that is just what are some areas of that are being involved, right? So if we have applied this certain control to address this risk, what does it mean to us? What is the new way of things? How does that new way impact us, right? And that is the part where it's always good to use like focus groups and maybe workshops, or even have scenarios internally where we are looking at it from different lenses, right? So the IT shops apply a control like two-factor authenticator, right? Everybody must use a single sign-on and everything is being federated. Or rather, everything is being, you can only authenticate using a two-factor authenticator. Okay, it makes sense to the IT shop. It makes sense to the HR sector. It makes sense to the legal department. Okay, those are all active, reasonable. Does it make sense to the person who is always out going into remote places with no internet connection or whatsoever? Maybe not. So how do we know that? That's the part where we'll have the different focus groups of the organizations and come up with different methodologies and strategies of making sure that everything is applicable to everyone. Meaning that the control we are applying enables all the different focus groups of the organization, not just one, not just IT, because unless we are able to identify that that risk or that vulnerability is only contained within the IT shop, meaning not the impact of the vulnerability, but rather addressing it only impacts the IT shop, then it's fine. An example will be maybe it's the server room where nobody has business going into the server room. And the IT shop feels like, you know what, we need to put some really strong locks at the door of the server room because nobody should have access, only the IT personnel should have it, and the entire IT personnel are on the same page that it's not going to affect them, and that's fine. HR either way have no business going into the server room. We have identified that. But another place is that we identify that if there is an incident, meaning that server room catches on fire, that there is a chance that the fire department might want to go in. So how are they going to go in, right? Now it's translating beyond the IT shop. So if the IT shop decide to put this biometric or some fancy IT mechanisms to allow in and out, does that mean that the fire department can use that? Or is there another entry point for that? All of those things, I know it's quite a lot to really think across all of those parts, but that's why we have different focus groups to come into the picture. I always say this, one of the secret weapons of risk professionals, in all honesty, is not to be the decision maker around everything, even proposing solutions, but one of their strength skill set is to interview the different units within the organization and to kind of tell them, like, this is what we plan on doing, how is it going to impact you? And the ability for risk professionals to read out what are those responses that are coming from the different focus groups that are only being focused in their entire group alone. That does not apply to the entire business. So yeah, it's the job of the risk professional to align everything to the business, but at the same time, there is the cheat of them interviewing everybody to see how different actions impact them, right? Scheduling and changes implementation. So from when is the right time to run an update? When is the need to communicate the changes we are going to do? So imagine I believe for a lot of us, we know these jokes of, if you are in the IT unit, please do not update the servers on Friday night because we're not ready to come back into early morning Mondays and everything is done, right? Terrible start of the week. Also, we hardly run updates, especially critical updates, during the peak working hours, right? It means you're interrupting everybody now. So the need to really schedule and implement the changes at the right time, as well as communicating it to the sectors and groups that will be impacted, right? We need a feedback and evaluation. Very important. How is it working? Is it effective? Measuring the operational efficiencies, right? Again, it could be from maybe customer service. An example could be, oh, Uber had so much bad negative price, a lot of things. That's a vulnerability. Actually, that's a risk because it's been impacting Uber. So Uber decided now their response is to take certain actions and ensuring maybe change their leadership team, start doing things that allow customers feel happy, provide some satisfaction or whatsoever. Obviously, it's very, very important for them now to provide some form of mechanism that allows them to receive certain feedback and to evaluate their response to that risk and see how effective it's been, right? It could be customer satisfaction. How happy are you with the new method? Should we keep doing it or should we change it? Those are all things around the process review, right? And certain techniques. Any question on this before I get into the next one? Trying to hit a certain point before we take a break. No questions? Great. Okay, I will quickly go into the control design and the implementation. This is kind of straightforward in terms of the risk mitigation is accomplished using controls. Obviously, we are applying controls. Controls could be managerial, could be technical, or could be physical. If not due to time, I will ask kind of everyone to give me an example, but I'm just gonna move forward, right? So ideally, as a risk professional, one will provide advice based on the selection, the design, the implementation, testing, and operations of controls, right? But then we know that controls are usually grouped into three kind of groups, right? They are grouped into three, and that is the managerial, technical, and physical control. An example of managerial control could be separation of duties, where a management is taking an action to separate the duties of employees so that one employee's job is not the same as the other, right? An example of technical control could be implementing two-factor authenticator. It could be applying a firewall. All of those things, right? Things that are technical related. Physical controls could involve having a fence. It could involve locks. It could involve things like having a screen filter, for example, right? Those are all an example of physical control. If there's anyone who doesn't understand the difference between managerial, technical, and physical controls, please let me know. If you do, it's fine. That's what we want. Now, beyond the groups, we also have different types of control. Again, we touch upon this in chapter 1, but we have the compensating, corrective, detective, deterrent, and preventive. Right? Can everybody please go on mute? Hello? Please, believe someone is.
No, I'm good, but what's up with the expense?
Thank you. Just a second, please, everyone. Okay. Around the compensating control, we also touch upon that. What is a compensating control? We did mention the different examples around compensating control, things that so we already have one control, but it's not enough, and now we're adding another to kind of compensate or at least close on that gap. But all of these, we have touched about them in detail in chapter 2, if you can remember, so I'll refer you back to that in the interest of time. If you have any specific question on this, please feel free to let me know. Okay. How do we monitor controls and the effectiveness? And I will give you a heads up. The next chapter is basically around monitoring. So again, this will sound kind of the same information, but after we implement the control, we constantly need to monitor it and understand its effectiveness. Around the technical side of things, we definitely have a SIEM, which is a SIEM is basically a tool that is that allows us to monitor and report on risk, right? Actual monitor and reporting is usually done by the tool, but in different phases. So an example of a SIEM tool is like Splunk, for example. If you don't know Splunk, please, I will highly recommend you definitely look into it. But what it does, it constantly captures logs. Actually, Splunk doesn't capture the logs, but rather is aggregate the logs. So your system will generate the logs and all of that. Sorry, it seems like I'm chatting privately. Let me switch to everyone and just write it for everyone to see. Splunk. It allows us to really make sense of the data that we are collecting from the logs. An example would be you have your device, you implement a control like the need for a password, right? But then you also put a control that says no one should be able to log into these devices after a certain hour. Let's say after work, after 5 p.m., that's one, right? So what happens is if someone tries to log in or they are able to log into a certain device after hours, once you capture that, it's going to then generate a log, right? With timestamp and all of those things. Splunk allows us to first review those logs and see who logged in and at what time. It also allows us, by the way, Splunk is just one tool. It's just that lately it's gaining so much traction across at least the government side of things. It's gaining so much traction into being a standard tool for log aggregation. You can set alerts on all of those things, so I highly recommend we look into it. But it provides those monitoring and making sure our controls are still effective. Okay. Next, we are going to look into, we will take a break in like 5 minutes. So I will try and see how much I can close with that. Types of risks. We also touched upon this already, like inherent risk. This is an assessed level of kind of raw untreated risk, right? Meaning that is kind of a natural level of risk. If you buy a device, it comes with its own risk. You have not done anything to that device or to address the risk that is considered an inherent risk, right? Meaning it's we haven't done anything to reduce the risk. Inherent risk is usually the current level of risk as well, right? Given that there is an existing set of controls rather than a hypothetical kind of approach of things, meaning you buy this device, Elasticstack, is that, Jonathan, is that Elasticstack, which product is that? Who owns the product? Oh,
It's
great.
I think it's Elastic.
Okay. Sounds like an AWS product. That's why I was asking. Yeah, there are quite a lot. I don't know what AWS. Wait, I think AWS have, is it CloudWatch or something like that? I
Yeah,
know
it's
on
like
Microsoft side. The
yeah. So they have like
organization-
all the stream and stuff that goes into Splunk and Elk.
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of them out there. Okay, that's inherent risk. We also have the residual risk. So this is the risk that remains after we implement a response, right? So after we have responded to the risk, whatever remains is considered residual risk. Inherent risk, we haven't responded to it. Inherent risk, we haven't responded to the risk. It's where we are currently without responding to the risk. Residual risk, we have responded to the risk. It's just that there is kind of like a remaining residual, right? Now, this is where it becomes confusing because current risk, some usually confuse it with residual risk. And also the book kind of did not clarify in depth, but this is the risk that exists in the moment. Like we are talking about right now. It usually takes into account all the actions that have been taken, that have already been taken, but not the anticipated risk. Sorry, not the anticipated action that we will take, or even the proposed one. So you cannot bring in your plan, like from POAM, to define what the current risk is. But sometimes we do look into like the POAM and make a proposal and say, okay, the residual risk will be this. After we have applied all of these controls, this is what is going to be the residual risk. But with current risk, we are talking about in current time, right? Not even a minute before or something like that. Any question on this? Because this is quite confusing, but guess what? It's another part that you will see in the questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
I have a question, Doctor, if you don't mind. So
Sure.
I know the inherent risk or residual risk are risks that being generated as a consequences of applying controls, right? But
no.
So the inherent risk, that is when you apply a control, right, to mitigate an already available risk, but after applying, you're already generating an additional or a new risk as a consequence of the applicable mitigation.
So not really. I'm so glad you asked that question. Then it tells me that I need to find another way to kind of clarify that. So not really. Inherent risk is a risk that you have not even attempted to take care of. You buy a product or whatsoever. Let's switch back to something. Let's switch to like a house. Let's say you just bought a house right now. And you go in after your, what do they call it? Not the assessment. God, when you're clear on a mortgage, there's something they do. Yeah, that's the assessment, right? They go around and tell you, there is this problem here, this problem here, this problem here. There is no light bulb here. The front door has no lock. As you haven't done anything, that risk, if you decide to buy that property, that is the inherent risk because you have not applied anything, right? So let's limit it to the front door. Let's say you bought a place with no front door. I hope not, but yeah, you got a place with no front door. If you agree to buy it, before you put the door whatsoever, that risk, the fact that there is no front door, that is what is considered the inherent risk. But then you go ahead and went into Home Depot and you bought a door, but there's no lock. You bought a door, you put the door. Obviously, you have reduced the risk because you now have some sort of privacy, I would say. Nobody can see into the house. People might not necessarily feel like, there is this open space, let me just walk into it, right? But still, such a risk is there, meaning there is no lock. If you find someone who is willing to now go and test it, they will realize like they can still walk in. The door is just sitting there with no mechanism to protect or provide any locking mechanism, right? That risk that remains is what we call the residual risk. Does that kind of provide some clarity into the differences?
It does, doctor, but it makes me ask you again. So what is called when you have a risk and you applied a control to mitigate it and you generate another risk? What does that called?
Oh, okay. So you were talking about earlier the risk that comes along with the new risk.
Yes.
Right? So we buy something, it comes with a new form of risk, right?
Yes. Yes.
Two ways to it. Did you apply the control to mitigate, or rather, did you apply the control to treat the risk that it comes with it, or did you buy the product to respond to a different risk and it also comes with its own separate one?
It's a known risk. So
Okay.
you didn't thought about it. You thought you would mitigate it and accept the residual risk. However, by applying the initial response, you actually generated an unknown risk you did not think about.
That's also an inherent risk in that scenario, because by applying the control to treat another risk, whatever is left over of that risk that you try to treat, that is a residual risk. But the new risk that the control is coming with, that is an inherent risk. So let's give a quick example. Let's say you buy a firewall, right? That firewall is meant to block certain traffic that you identified. That, oh, I don't want these IPs accessing my environment. As such, I'm going to put this firewall to block those traffic. Perfect. By applying the firewall and blocking those traffic, if there are still certain nuances or rather certain risk that remains, such as, oh, the firewall is only blocking at the network level, it's not blocking anything at the application layer, that is considered a residual risk. But then, if the firewall in itself has some form of a backdoor that will provide another channel to access your firewall device in itself, it has nothing to do with the blocking traffic that you originally bought the firewall for. That part of the backdoor is considered an inherent risk.
Yep, that's correct. That's pretty much.
Does that make sense?
It's very interesting because ISACA, how they approach the inherent risk is different than ISC Square somehow, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Because ISC Square, I believe they all consider the device and to take this overarching single risk that applies to all of it and just say the residual risk is considered everything that is applicable to the firewall, including the inherent risk.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, I don't like it. I really do not. But that is part of those delineations of the different sectors, and it is what tends to make their certifications hard. It is not because people do not have the knowledge. It's just, are you really thinking of it based on how they want you to think while taking the exams? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you need to answer the questions based on what they think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is kind of a mess.
In their terms of understanding. So, doctor, about the current risk, you mentioned it's like simultaneous, correct? So it's like spontaneous. How would you measure that risk?
Yeah. The current risk within an current risk right now.
Yes.
How would I measure
instantly?
that risk?
Instantly. So normally long-term risk, you can measure them, by impact and likelihood, and this is like the normal formal methods we are aware of. But with the current risk, this is instantaneous. Like how would you measure that accurately?
Very good question, and that's a good segue into our next page, next slide around control metrics, right? To measure it. But let's take 5 minutes and come back exactly at 8 p.m. if you're on the Eastern time, 8 p.m. That's basically 5 minutes. Please try to be back on time because we have a lot to cover. For those of you that want to chat, I'll still be here and we can chat. Dave, can we please pause it? information security in this context is not talking about cybersecurity or whatsoever, no, but rather we are really being literal here, right? Information around data, information in itself, and that security. Lately, the term information security, cybersecurity, security are all kind of intertwined, but now we are talking about activities related to protecting information, right? Information can be considered one of the organizational assets, right? One, we have change control, where as a risk professional, we must be aware of the risk associated with any changes, right? We touched a little bit on how having a different hardware can introduce a certain issue or a different software. If you remember back in chapter 2, when we in chapter 1, when we are doing the risk identification, we talk about how risk can be identified within software, OS, software and OS something, network, hardware devices, all of those things, right? So change control. Before you adopt cloud, we keep talking cloud. Before you adopt and modernize and switch to cloud, did you really look into how it's going to impact you? Now, looking into how it's going to impact you is now around best practice, right? Before you do it. But let's assume that the organization is, like we are seeing it in the government space a lot, there is lack of understanding of the cloud. As such, what kind of control can we put in place to ensure that before any change is made, we actually look into those risks and evaluate it? So now we're not talking about doing the evaluation and whatsoever, but we are actually thinking of putting a control to ensure that something doesn't happen, right? In the sense of, before we migrate instantly to the cloud, or before I nuke my little thumb drive and say like, okay, I'm moving everything to Google Drive, do we have mechanisms in place that ensure I don't take those actions without checking these things? That is part of change control. So before any changes happened, what do we have in place that will ensure that any change to any of those kind of things that have been identified will not impact the security or risk culture of the organization, right? That's around change control. System authorization, for those of us in the government space again, we are familiar with the A&A, used to be C&A, basically either assessment and authorization, or if you're still on the old-fashioned diagram, we know it as the certification and accreditation, right? But this is just making sure that a system goes through a certain check, validation, review, approval before the system is allowed to replace or be a new system or change anything, right? So you have maybe this old ginormous device, maybe a mainframe computer that certain organizations with money are still running, right? And now they feel like, okay, it's time for us to change, you know? Maybe the old people that are really used to those mainframes have now all retired. And now the new generation that have taken over are willing to now put their own way of things that allows them to modernize so that they also keep it so they get to their retirement when it becomes the old fashioned, right? You'll be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if I come across any agency that still uses CDs or even diskette or floppy drives. Anyway, now, before we make a change, or rather before we move to this new system, it needs to be approved or authorized. That is all part of that ATU process, right? To ensure that it's been reviewed, approved, right? A formal review process to ensure that we look at it from a risk-based approach, which we did say we are going to attempt something like similar to what is being done within the government, an ATO process, right? We will do it towards the end of the class. Asset inventory and configuration management revolves around making sure first we are tracking our inventories. That's also something. But also when technical controls are added, like they should be also added to certain database, like the configuration management database, right? Just to ensure we are tracking what controls are in there and how are we monitoring and tracking them. We all know how overwhelming it starts to become when you start having so many things in terms of, especially for sysadmins. Imagine having to spin up 100 VMs and you are not even naming them correctly or tagging them correctly to know that, okay, these 5 VMs are related to the HR unit, or these 5 VMs are meant for the legal department. Now you have a bunch of VMs with just random names that you are even unable to identify which one it is, right? As such, configuration management starts becoming hard because you cannot really tell which VM needs to be configured in terms of how it supports its organizational unit. Same thing with inventory. Imagine if an organization doesn't do an inventory and just gives everybody a new laptop, like, here it is, whatsoever. Nothing stops me from saying, like, yeah, I returned my laptop 2 months ago. Remember, I kept it for you, like, on the desk. I gave it to you, whatsoever. So much is happening in life, and because there is no inventory, asset tagging whatsoever, truly it's kind of difficult to say. And there is no check-in and check-out process for all those devices. It now starts becoming an issue of how do we track that, right? Third-party management, definitely a big deal, especially around like managed service providers, cloud service providers, all of those. So when we talk about managed service provider, it could be also a cloud hosting provider, right? Or cloud service provider. But earlier we were talking about the need for monitoring. We spoke a lot around SIEM tools and whatsoever. Again, I'll give an example with the government side of things. Most times within the government, for a lot of these agencies, you find that most times consultants come in and do the security jobs, right? For like the operational center, you find, say, organizations like Deloitte, Booz Allen, all of these are the ones really running the day-to-day operations. Now, let me just give an example with like Deloitte. Deloitte might decide to, like, you know what, we are going to build all the tools that are needed for a SOC, like the Security Operations Center, that are targeting continuous monitoring to ensure we always understand the current risk and the current security posture. Instead of the government agency to be going in and just getting different licenses, trying to put all these different tools together, another vendor, a third party might decide, like, you know what, I'm just going to buy all of these tools, put them all bundled together and sell them as a single product, or even deploy them to different organizations, and I'll be a managed service provider. That's what it means to be a managed service provider, right? When you start looking at that, there are also risks associated with that. That is, what are the service level agreements? Imagine having a blank agreement like, yeah, you will be the one doing my continuous monitoring, but we did not define, like, okay, I expect you to be on site 24/7. I do not anticipate any downtime that is more than 30 minutes. I absolutely will want a minimum, at a very minimum, 10 staffs constantly looking at the dashboard to understand the security posture of my organization. These are all things that goes into the service level agreement. If you don't have that in place, you don't have those things, I mean, you give me a blank contract and we didn't itemize those things, I can say, like, hey, I didn't know that you needed me to be on site on Saturday and Sunday, or even after 5 p.m., and we never agreed to it. That also provides an opportunity for me to now say, like, well, if you want me on site, now we need to change the contract. We all know that. We touch a little bit on scope creep. That's one of those things. Okay, cloud service provider could be Microsoft, could be AWS, with Microsoft Azure, anybody that is providing those kind of cloud services, right? Cloud service doesn't stop at the major providers. Google Drive is a cloud service. Well, the company that owns it is the major one. But let's talk about like Dropbox, for example, or Box. All of these are also cloud service providers, right? There is, the minute you start using those products, first and first, there is an inherent risk that also comes with it. Like, if you're using them, you're inheriting their risk. It's up to you to respond to those risks or to be comfortable with where they are and just move forward, right? Again, when you look at it from the government side of things, that's why, because the government does not want the decision of what is the benchmark for which risk should be accepted at the very, very minimum. So baseline, what is it for any cloud service provider before they are allowed to serve the government? That is why we have places like FedRAMP or DISA, where before a cloud service provider is allowed to start serving the government, they have to be FedRAMP authorized. So they have to be at a certain level, right? And then you start looking at places like, say, the DoD or any of the IC community, where for them, actually even the FedRAMP, for any cloud service provider to serve the government, they must have a dedicated data center that only houses government data. So government is still unwilling to accept that cloud sharing model that is related to others, non-government entity. But when you look at it from like the FedRAMP side, civilian side, yeah, it's fine. FedRAMP is okay with maybe you as a cloud service provider hosting IRS data alongside HHS data in the same data center or even the same server. It's totally fine, all government data. But then also there are other agencies you start talking about, like the intelligence or defense, where they also, even within the government, they do not agree with the notion of actually the data residing in the same server as the other government entities, right? So all of those are around the cloud service provider risk management, where the government from the high level is using either DISA or FedRAMP to set what the minimum requirement should be for it to be used by government entities. Then beyond that, agencies can now also say, like, you know what? We are not going to use it even if it's FedRAMP authorized unless you are willing to add these mechanisms or you allow us implement these additional controls for it to meet our needs. So we are all seeing that. Same thing when you start looking at it from like HIPAA, it says, oh, it must be HIPAA compliant. It's still setting those standards, right, for the provider. Okay, data management. When we talk about data management, now we are talking about things like identity management, around authentication, around cryptography, around all of those things, right? In terms of, there are things like separation of duties. Segregation is considered now an old word of duties, but it's one of the words that we use. Again, separation of duties is the same thing, right? Job rotation, these are all around data management. Or either by putting the control on the entity themselves, meaning you put the control on the subject, not the object, or you can also put the control on the object. Subject and object in this context applies to the object, meaning the data itself, and the subject, meaning the person or the entity accessing the data. So you can put the control on the object by encrypting it. That is around cryptography. Or you can put the control on the subject by identity management, by security clearances, by job rotation, by separation of duties, by ensuring only the right person access that object, right? Access controls. From a generic viewpoint, cryptography tends to apply to the object, especially around like data encryptions when it comes to like encrypting the data at rest, including encrypting the data in transit and all of those things. It puts the control mechanism on the object. If you are lost on that, is there anyone, please, that is kind of lost on that subject and object example here, so I can really spend some time, because it's quite important and it's something that you might see it pop up elsewhere, not just on ISACA exam, where we can say something of this individual is accessing this information and now we apply this control to really, maybe, instead of hypotheticals, let me just use myself. Ibrahim is now accessing the student records. And before Ibrahim gains access to the student records, Ibrahim needs to maybe decrypt the information using this encryption key that was provided whatsoever. Looking at this situation, where are we applying the security control? Is it at the subject level or at the object level? Considering maybe when you look at it from ISACA context, ISACA sees subject as someone who is taking the action of accessing the end result. The end result is always the object. Is there anyone who is lost on this so I can spend maybe additional minute to visualize it? Because I feel like it's quite important. Feel free to just raise your hand or even just comment in the chat. You know what? I don't need to call people on the spot. Let me spend a minute and just add to it, okay? Here we have the data. Just a second. We have the data, and this is me. Funny enough, I am this skinny. Anyway, I am now accessing this data, right? It is maybe the student record. Student records. So the fact that I'm accessing this, if you want to, perfect, Jonathan, I agree with you. That dark and mark, I didn't want to get so much into DOD and then before we start going into rainbow tables and whatsoever. So I will keep it high level. But yeah, depending on where you're putting the control, is it applicable if someone decides to encrypt all of these records, right? And not give me the key to access it? That's one way of securing the data, right? Absolutely, absolutely one way of securing it. Or you can put some form of mechanism here, decide not to encrypt the data, right? But then you put some hard mechanism here that says, guess what? You do not have access around that access control, right? That is also applying a control. So in this scenario, I am the subject and this is the object, right? That we're trying to access. So if a quiz exam come up and talks about access control where we are putting username, password, all of those things before we are allowed to access this, then it means we are putting the control of the subject on the subject. Again, we can put the control on the object if we are now only encrypting this and leaving this blank open. So if anybody understands this, just quick question. When we are browsing online and there is a TLS and SSL certificate, where are we applying the control? Good question. Any volunteer?
What's the question again, doctor, if you don't mind?
If we are accessing a web page and we are now kind of accessing something that has some form of a TLS certificate, like a web page with a TLS certificate in front of it and whatsoever, just that ensures we have all the data that is in transit secured and whatsoever, we share the information. Where are we putting the control that provides that protection mechanism? Is it on the subject or the object?
Subject.
I think you can put it on both.
It would be the object, wouldn't it? So that you could have server-side protection.
Absolutely. That will be the object because that's what we are accessing, right? On the server side protection. I agree with that. Now, if we are to put some form of a username and a password before we are allowed access to something, that will be the subject, right? We are putting the protection mechanism on the subject because we are stopping the subject from accessing it by blocking the subject, not necessarily encrypting the data. Fair point?
But doctor, isn't true that you can put that on the subject as well? But you put him in an organization or put him in a group control where you already vet anyone to come in this group, that you don't have to separate him or manually do it. Once you get him vetted, he will always access the data. So you can put it on,
absolutely
on both. Yeah, like rule-based control and role-based control.
That's absolutely true. If we have it all over the place, then it's been applicable to everyone, right? Harry, please go ahead. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Right. So my question is, I copy that the TLS control is at the object. Would you say then in a zero trust framework, the control is at the subject?
So with the zero trust framework, right, we are seeing at it holistically. For those of you who do not know, Zero Trust Framework is this new mechanism that we are all embracing that tends to also come along with the DevSecOps approach and whatsoever. But Zero Trust Framework also is a bit aligned with security in depth, right? Where we are seeing it and going in depth. So I will say it's applicable across. Because part of Zero Trust Framework will require you to encrypt the data and also to have an access control mechanism in place for the subject. Do you agree? Depending on which implementation approach you're taking.
Yeah, so no, my question was, I'm trying to distinguish between object and subject, right? So I kind of follow the TSL control is at the object level. With the Zero Trust Framework, put that control at the subject or identity access management level? That's my question.
Yes, and the reason why I cannot give you a direct answer is it depends on which Zero Trust implementation you are following. Because Zero Trust, again, even though it's a framework, it's a more of a concept on how things are approached, right?
Okay.
Rather than this is just a single way of doing things.
Okay.
That's how you will talk about this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me reframe the question then. No, I agree. I understand better now. So in the terms of if controlling the identity, credential, access management, the control there is more on the subject, correct?
Yeah. Yes. When you talk about IAM solutions, they are meant to stop from accessing what is behind that lock, what is behind that IAM. The data sitting behind could be in plain text, unencrypted, but the IAM solution is meant to stop the user. So that I will say it's a control that is meant to stop the subject. Yeah.
Okay, Roger, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Again, this is actually a good segue because you mentioned now the Zero Trust. That's why we have systems and security control design and implementations, right? Different approaches. But in addition to that, we obviously have testing mechanisms. We have application testing, we have system tests, we have network and network tests. I will touch upon this at a very high level without going in depth. Just from the name, it's kind of straightforward. Application testing involves testing various and different things at the application layer, right? Including like unit, this is where you do things like unit tests, you do like code review, you do things like regression testing, force testing, all of those things, like looking into what are the OWASP step 10, right? Then you start looking at also those system tests. You can also, penetration testing also is applicable across because it's applicable all over from the application system as well as the network, right? But as the name implies, it's just doing various tests at the different stages to ensure that your control design is effective and you have implemented it the right way, right? Now, a very good thing to always pay attention to is now that we have implemented our control. Earlier, can everybody please go on mute? Thank you. We touched upon system development lifecycle, software development lifecycle. We've been throwing things like DevSecOps, DevOps, Agile, whatsoever. These are all methodologies on how to build tools, how to implement, approach, as well as like project management things, right? But now that we are done implementing the control, keep in mind if we are following that SDLC approach, then we definitely have some form of build stage, development stage, testing phase, that all those test stage, staging, and now we have like that production ready stage, right? Where we have tested everything, we made sure like, okay, now we are willing to make this go live, right? Now we are willing to make this the main tool, or rather the main system or the main application, and start depreciating the other one. It is very important to determine which approach should we use to migrate from our old processes to the new one. That is where we have that changeover, the go-live approach. We have a parallel changeover. If you are lost with my explanation, let me give you a clear example. Marymount, we use Gmail. Let's say Marymount realizes, like, listen, we are using Gmail, but all of our students need access to Microsoft Office 365 services. And instead of buying bulk licenses, assuming Microsoft doesn't provide for students for free, but instead of buying licenses for students to use Word, PowerPoint, whatsoever, I think it's more valuable for us to migrate from Gmail to Outlook, because Outlook will give you access to all of those Word documents whatsoever. Now, first, because it saves money rather than paying for two different products, and we have finished building it. We have now bought the licenses. The IT shop have tested it and whatsoever, and they are ready to switch everybody. Should my Marymount instantly stop and say, that's it, we are decommissioning Gmail right now and just switching to Outlook instantly, or should they do it in a phased approach? The one that I said instantly is considered the abrupt, or should they do a parallel approach, right? So let's look at all of those approach and discuss them in detail. So the parallel approach involves having Marymount Gmail still running and Outlook still running. What the good side of this is there will be zero downtime, because it allows us to test doing things in Outlook while we have our Gmail. So if anything is to go wrong in the new way of things, we know we have the Gmail to go back to. The bad side, or I would say the disadvantage most times, is it can be quite expensive because it requires both systems to be running. It means Marymount must be paying for Gmail licenses when it also is paying for the Outlook licenses, even if it's for 1 month. Marymount needs to plan for that. That is the parallel approach, where two systems are running until we are comfortable with the new process, then we begin decommissioning the other one. Then we have the phased approach of switching. The phased approach requires taking different entities and parts and just migrating them. Let's say Marymount decides, like, okay, first we are going to start with the IT department. The IT department is going to move completely to Outlook, and we are now going to decommission or revoke their license on Gmail and see how it plays out with just IT running on Outlook. If everything goes smoothly whatsoever, then the second phase of the migration will be to move the School of Business. Then we'll move the other schools, and then we'll move the HR department, then we'll move everybody. That's kind of like the phase changeover, right? That allows for kind of components of the old system to be replaced with the new, similar to just saying, okay, we have the IT shop migrate to Outlook, and we have the other entities running through on the Gmail. By doing that, it allows Marymount to save costs. It allows Marymount to see how does it impact just the IT shop. One disadvantage could be compatibilities, right? Meaning, oh, it could be that the Outlook is not compatible with Gmail. So by doing that, we have basically really isolated IT from communicating with other entities unless those other entities have migrated to the new system, that is Outlook, that IT is on. That could be a disadvantage of the phase changeover. Then the last one, which is not usually the ideal situation, that's the abrupt, meaning Marymount says, hey, today is the 28th of September, tomorrow, 29th September at 12 a.m., Gmail will be inaccessible and everybody should go into their Outlook. That is an abrupt changeover. What that means on the bright side of things, the advantage is that instant changeover reduces the overhead of cost. It also allows for the system to all be migrated at once. The disadvantage is the system admins will now start getting so many calls. Another disadvantage is If the new system instantly collapses, then we have created this single point of failure, right? That's the abrupt challenge, changeover approach. Now, let's look at certain impacts on new technologies. We have touched upon this where we said new risks are continuously becoming, new threats and vulnerabilities are always coming up, but as new technologies are coming up and new and emerging technologies, they can present business opportunities, but they could also present newer threats as well as newer vulnerabilities, newer form of risk, right? So what are some impacts of emerging technologies on controls, meaning existing controls? One, improving operations, obviously, because they are emerging, they are new, there hasn't been trust established, right? There has not been validation or feedback across the entire industry or sector to know their status. Undiscovered vulnerabilities, they are new, untested, I would say from a business skill. Maybe it's been tested when developing, but not necessarily within the environment. So we'll have to see which vulnerabilities present themselves. Again, new threat vectors. As new technologies present themselves, they present newly equipped vectors, like from actors to whatsoever. So we talk about example like deep fakes, then it presents newer vectors of people being able to create a fake person by just using those face swap or whatsoever it is that they do, right? That's a new threat vector. Lack of skills and training, as always, with emerging technologies, as well as emerging controls or new processes. If you're familiar with the new CMMC for DoD, the DoD is now requiring all contractors to be in compliance with CMMC. You will understand that still it's new, there are not a lot of auditors that know how to use it, so it's safe to say that there is still a lack of skills and training. That's why DoD, I think, there is this independent body that is now coming up with ways to educate the entire sector, right? They are coming up with training materials and whatsoever. And obviously, with emerging technologies, we might face business interruptions because we don't even know what those risks are by leveraging those new technologies and new controls. So it could also present its own challenge that will ultimately result into some form of interruption. Okay? As always, we keep saying that with every risk must be associated with who owns it. That part of ownership is who owns the risk control in itself, who is responsible and accountable for responding to the risk, including coming up with the plans and the monitoring, reporting, compliance, all of those things, right? Any question on this? We touched upon this in depth in terms of the responsibility and accountability and the difference between the two and how the two kind of come together. Any specific question on this around the risk control ownership or anything else? Okay, if there is none, then this brings us to the end of this chapter, right? We touch on risk awareness, we touch on changes of to risk, due to new threats, new vulnerabilities, the environmental changes, and also changes in asset value, right? And basically part of that control effectiveness. We all touch upon that. Again, this is that part where I'm still going to apologize. My goal was to really close on this chapter and then chapter 4. We are behind on a single chapter, not going according to the syllabus. I apologize if it impacts any of you, but I also want to assure you that it is not going to be an issue, whether from a time sensitivity or you getting to where you need to get to in the class. If at any point you feel the fact that we are behind a little bit is going to impact you, please, please, please let me know, and it's on me to identify how it's not going to impact you. But I assure you that we will close the gap, absolutely. hopefully the next class as I keep pushing forward. But if we don't close it in the next class, when it comes to that, during the ATO, especially the first step 0, the planning phase, I know from teaching this class that I never have to take the entire class time to cover it. These chapters are the ones that usually take kind of most of the class time. And I think that one day that we kind of just open the floor, having more of a conversation than trying to knock out the full chapter is what resulted into us being a chapter behind. But I'll show you, we will close the gap. But please, please, please let me know if it begins to impact you. I'll show you I'm willing to work with you on that. Any question on this? Any other question beyond today's chapter?
Professor, this is John Holmblad. I have a question.
I'm sorry?
I have a question. You know, in risk characterization, I guess the probabilistic concepts of single loss expectancy and annual loss expectancy come up, you know, when you're doing a financial treatment of risk. Are we going to be looking at risk from that perspective in this course?
No. The reason why we are not looking at it from that annual angle and that single loss expectancy is because of two things. One, we are leveraging the government approach to doing ATO, and when you start looking at those loss expectancies are more aligned with other sectors, so we are taking more of a business impact analysis, right? To do it. That is around that government RMF. The single loss and annual loss and everything is usually associated with like the cost benefit analysis. If you remember in the chapter A, we identified how can we, what are the different methodologies that we come up with when trying to determine and categorize a risk. Obviously, we touch upon cost benefit analysis. There are other ones in place. I think we had a slide with so many of them in chapter 1. I will revisit those slides. The book also did not touch upon them at a granular detail. It doesn't ask you that. But for this class, one of those methodologies was business impact analysis, which is what the NIST RMF approach uses. That is what we are going to use in this class to categorize. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
But I'm looking forward to one thing though. Do you see, is there like a specific value you think or like you're looking for other than knowing that like the business sector, especially those that deal with so much numbers and seeing their value based on profit, that tend to use those single loss as well as the annual loss, including like revenue generated and whatsoever. Is there a reason specifically that you are thinking of if you are going to look at it from that way? Because if it's going to clarify certain things, I'm absolutely willing to kind of, even if you don't do it, maybe find a way to kind of integrate it a little bit into what we are going to do so it provides some additional knowledge.
Yeah, the answer is yes. In fact, I'm thinking in terms of, you know, private sector, if you will, applications of these risk management practices. And of course, in the private sector, there's going to be more of a tendency to try to, you know, get to a quantitative understanding of risk in terms of, you know, dollars and cents, basically, as opposed to a purely qualitative one.
Yes, 100% agree. I can't remember who was it in this class, but please do me a favor and kind of speak up. Someone was telling me that they are familiar with the ISACA approach and other frameworks. For those of you on the business side of things, honestly, I'm more into that government side of things, so you will keep hearing me talking about the government. But please, I am begging you, if you know so much of the business side and the commercial side of things, please speak up Um, have anyone ever used that single loss expectancy as well as the annual by quantifying it with like numbers and saying, okay, annually, if we take this approach, how much is it going to impact us? Anybody have some experience that they want to share? No one? Or is it like it's way too late? Like, yo, Ibrahim, just let us go, man.
I think it's way too late.
I know. I have a bad habit of holding everybody till I exhaust myself.
I've actually had to deal with computing that for a deployment. It's not as
Awesome.
easy. As
I'm so sorry. Who's talking, please? I apologize.
This is Jordan Klein.
Hey, Jordan. Yeah, what's up?
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I've had to deal with all of that, and as somebody who was never the biggest mathlete in the world, it's a little complicated just to try and figure out. You know, you have to gather a lot of information, look up a lot of data, hope there's a lot of data out there to tell you what the expectancy is, you know, what the average is between loss, what the average is, you know, how old the device is to begin with. You have to hope that the people that came before you documented, you know, when it was purchased, how old it is, how it was maintained, etc. There's a lot to go in, but once you get all the numbers, it's not that bad. A lot of it, you know, it's just math, so it's plug and play in the formula. It's just getting those numbers that can be the real headache. But once you have the numbers, and if it's something that's been documented before, then you know, it's a lot easier. The way I was having to deal with it was with expansion. We were trying to determine, you know, with elasticity, how much the company was going to grow versus how much we wanted to, you know, buy modular firewalls that, you know, as we grew, we could put different modules in to either increase privacy or security or increase usability and function, et cetera, versus how long is it going to take for it to burn out. So if we didn't think that we were going to expand to where we would need to use a modular firewall, then was it worth the extra expense of getting one based on its, you know, diminishing returns of when that firewall isn't going to be useful anymore and we're going to need to upgrade it anyways. And it was quite the undertaking.
Mm.
And I can,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is John Holmblad again. I can offer a similar case, and actually this is in the federal sector where I work in the Senate. About 8 years ago, we used the concepts that Gordon and Lieb have in their model before I even knew about the model to do a similar investment analysis for web proxy technology, such as it was back then, almost a decade ago. And the financial analysis turned out to be quite robust. In fact, it was strong enough that the then CIO was convinced, and he was otherwise quite reluctant to make the investment, but he was convinced that it was worthwhile. And it turned out the investment analysis was correct. It did actually exceed quite significantly the expected return that we thought we were going to get out of it by implementing it. So that's kind of a counterexample in the public sector, but in fact, my interest is really more towards the application of this in the private sector, where you tend to have, you know, a genuine interest, not just at the board level, but you know, at the you know, C level in terms of profitability and return on investment kind of things.
So you know what I just picked right now, and I think this is that part of being a former researcher in me, where I think a lot of things from my research. You both mentioned two things that kind of are interesting. I can't remember who spoke the first time, but there was this mention of really putting together everything. So did you have to really estimate like the value of the assets? Like, let's take an example, maybe a hardware device where you now have to consider its depreciating value to really come up with the numbers?
Yes.
Oh God. Let me guess, there is no framework or any methodology that allows you to do that. Is there?
No, but in this particular case, we were faced with different choices to make about which investment to make, and we had information about the cost of each of those, and we had an estimate, and it was an estimate. It wasn't, perfectly accurate, but an estimate of the amount of cost savings we would accrue from making the investment, and cost savings in terms of reduced remediation costs of systems that would otherwise get compromised, but because of the implementation of this technology, they would not get compromised. So, it did involve a good bit of estimation process, but in the end, it all kind of, if you will, mathematically hung together, and in retrospect, it was borne out in reality. In other words, what actually happened based on our forecast of what would happen.
You see, listening to that, all I keep thinking is, if we do not have a standardized way of doing those estimates, everybody is just basically going here and there to just find a way to do that without a universal language. That is absolutely just the fact that identifying that problem in itself is an interesting paper that can be published. And if you're able to come up with a framework that solves that, that's the dissertation to me. Honestly, I mean, I might be taking too far,
okay.
but it's
Well,
definitely a segue into that.
Yeah, excuse me, President. Let me just say that I did share the link to the Gordon Lee model in the chat window, so anybody interested can go watch the animation. It's anybody that knows how to do net present value investment analysis will immediately understand what they're doing, because that's what these gentlemen are. They're economists, and they understand how that's how the processes work. But they took the innovative step 20 years ago to apply that kind of analysis to the problem of cybersecurity technology investment. And they've actually written, in addition to their scholarly papers, they've written at least one textbook on it called The Economics of Cybersecurity. So, and they hold a conference every year actually at the University of Maryland. Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it gets my attention because of my background in the business world that I saw immediately. Well, and actually, as I said, we were using it at the Senate before I even knew about the model. And then I realized when I saw the model, oh, yes, I get this. It's exactly what we were doing. So.
Quite funny that you mentioned that you use it. And like you see, I did some couple of projects within the Treasury and like places like NCUA, but we still follow things by looking at it from not that economic side, but looking at it from, if we don't take this action, what is the impact, and not on a monetary value. But yes, I understand. This is really interesting. This is a quick clarification. I know for some of us, we are constantly chatting. Please, the class has ended. If you find these conversations boring, there is absolutely no need to hang around. We will catch up next week. But I will still be here for the next 15 minutes if other people want to catch up or have a specific question. But yeah, thank you both for sharing. This is really interesting. I'm going to watch that video, and on my part as well, especially how you keep saying that economics of cybersecurity, I think it's something that I should look into and kind of understand. My entire process and understanding have always been from that federal perspective, from an impact kind of reasoning, right? Not seeing it from that money. Now, I understand it, and I understand the need for that, but if you had to ask me which will be, and I kid you not, but if you had to ask me what would be the best methodology to apply or framework to apply to make a justification for the kind of business, commercial sector that looks at things from really hard dollar value, yeah, it will be a bit challenging for me to give you a single framework and say this go with this because it's going to give you that way of doing the analysis from a money value. Yeah, I actually don't have that. If you ask me for the government, ask me for the DoD sector or the IC or the civilian side, I think I can recommend that. Wow, that's quite interesting. I mean, even the categorization we do here, like you take even the sensitive side from like using CNSSI 1253, it differs a little bit from that NIST 800-60 and the FIPS 199 because it sees it from not just the information type, but the impact to classification information, classification of that confidentiality, integrity, and availability at the different layers. It's still kind of impact-based approach, right? So you're looking at it from that low, moderate, high. And there's this formula where if you have, okay, low, low, moderate, it's just overall moderate categorization. Or if you have anything that is higher, at least on the civilian side, anything that is higher, any categorization that is at a higher level, automatically the system is considered that impact level. So if you have like that low, low, moderate, then the system should be moderate. If you have low, low, high, then the system should be high.
That's the high watermark approach.
Oh, I see. So that's what's called also similar approach within the government, the commercial side is considered the high watermark approach. Because
well, in fact, that terminology is even used in NIST standards. I've seen it referred to within, and I don't remember the exact, SP number, so, but definitely it's, a used concept.
I would say there is a little bit challenging line right there, because the minute you start talking about that high watermark, yes, I think I understand why you're coming from those NIST documentation, but I assure you, someone pick up, someone from like the DoD or the IC community, the minute you start talking about that high watermark, they are no longer thinking of categorization, they are thinking of labeling. So are you labeling the system as a TS, a secret, or confidential, which can still be, it can be a low system, but it's still considered TS, right? So I think we tend to see watermarking more around labeling than we see it around system categorization. Does anyone have a different experience when it comes to watermarking? Anyone on the .gov site? Hello?
I'm here, but no, I don't. I mean, just the experience you've mentioned with classification levels from the government side.
Yeah, like I know the government side with classification. The minute I start hearing from watermark, honestly, the entire field is that overlays are more of controls, right? Additional controls depending on the categorization.
And I think it all goes down to the labeling too. It's a weird one.
Yeah, it goes to labeling, I agree. Especially anything above IL6, right?
Yeah.
If you start talking about above IL6 and then way higher, then I 100% agree with that. But still, more around watermarking. That's true. Still, it's interesting. The entire field, so many terminologies that needs to be mapped. Even within the Gulf side, I know you find, it's so funny how you go to a place like the civilian side, there's just so much reference to SSPs, but then you go to like the DoD, and instead of hearing so much emphasis on SSP, you keep hearing SCTM. So even there are deltas. Interesting. Thanks for sharing. Anyone with any question, any topic, anything to catch up on in the rest 10 minutes? Keep in mind, like you don't have to hang around, but I'll be here. You want to touch upon anything? No one? Everybody tired? Everybody exhausted?
Dr. Waizari, quick question.
Yeah, sure.
When do you plan to update Canvas to include the other modules? Because like right now, I can only see up to module 4.
Yes. So,
which I think is
wait,
this week.
you can only see to module 4?
Me personally, I can only see up to module 4.
I'm
I
the
can
same.
see up to module 5.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if you're on the online side of things, module 4, if you're in the online class, that's maybe because we have not unlocked it, but we have basically built everything. I know last week I had this commitment of we are going to unlock all of those. Honestly, all the slides are open. It's just trying to come up with the security questions that are relevant today, right? More around that risk management. So I think what we will do is we will just unlock it, including all the activities, since the slides are ready, and then I will find some time to really, Dave and I will work on those security questions. So please bear with us on the security questions, but we'll open the activities and everything for the other modules. You should see it by this week because we have that in place.
okay. Thank
A
you.
lot of interesting actually tractions going on around the entire industry, especially in the ATO side of things for the government, like things around OSCA, DoD trying to switch to RMF. So really trying to see how can we come up with some interesting questions that will allow everyone to not necessarily be an expert, but at least be conversant. When you hear OSCA, I think you should know what OSCA means out of this class because it's interesting, right? You hear DevSecOps, kind of understand where we are. Even if you don't play within the .gov side, it provides you with, in my viewpoint, I am of the opinion that the government side, I know we tend to say the federal side and the government side is really behind on technology adoption, but I think when it comes to really risk management, the government side is way ahead of any other sector, including the commercial sector. Thinking about entire risk management literally started from DoD. So, yeah. Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Any topic of discussion? None? Anyone? Maybe we should open and then I will challenge everyone to really look out, especially those of you that are not in that risk management world, maybe look into it and I would say be 10% in one. Just seriously, learn how to do one. Now, a lot of you might think I am that's just a bunch of BS he's talking about. It's totally fine if you say that. But I honestly feel like as annoying and as mundane, as challenging, not necessarily difficult, the risk management field is, it is the one place that you constantly find that there is a need for people who know how to satisfy a certain standard, be it a framework. There is always a constant need for people who know how to do HIPAA or people who know how to implement NIST controls for the government, people who know how to satisfy PCI DSS. And it's a field that is not gonna go away. It's unlike saying like, yeah, I'm a very good data scientist such that tomorrow is no longer like the thing, it has evolved into machine learning. Nope. I think these are policies, these are frameworks, these are basically our guidance things. They will constantly evolve. Just like NIST, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, released the Rev 5 of the NIST 800-53. The new version is out. But I don't see it as a field that is going away. It is a field that will constantly evolve. So I always say this. I personally started my career as also a full IT person, and I still don't consider myself as focused on fully risk, but I'm very conversant in it. And I always kind of advise on, if you really, really want just a backup thing where you constantly feel like you are relevant and additional plan B opportunity, I will take risk management. It is not hard to do. It is just mapping the concept around, and once you get them, they become like, super easy to continuously do it. But then it also always provides you with that opportunity that there are availabilities. Please, if anyone disagree with me that, no, I do not see RMF as something that is constantly in demand, please let me know, especially if you live in the Nova area. Anyone kind of say it a different way? How about this? Is there anyone who agrees with me? Not looking for validation, but looking for someone to chat with.
I want to comment on what you said, Doctor. I want to ask for your opinion as well. So this is a great point you just mentioned about thinking of like as like a backup plan or something that you would like to get into and challenge yourself. So being technical, and I think you know, like around 3 years old, that age of things, you know, so being technical or what you call like mid-career, how hard it is to transfer over to this field, right? Like we feel like we're kind of like technical, but there are certain roles, you know what they mean, you know how to do the job, but you don't have an established history or record conducting these to put on a resume. So how would you satisfy the employer that yes, you can be in the management, you know, like information system security officer or manager, you know, on a scale of a program level, because we're talking about a program level now at a minimum. So could you please elaborate more on that? Like, how would you market yourself?
So me wearing my now hat of, which I really am not, but that career advocate as well as career guidance person, I'll be honest with you. If you come from any IT shop, I don't care, any IT shop, then you basically are doing a part of the risk management. Because the idea of being a sysadmin where you're constantly collecting backups in itself, guess what? The need to do backups in itself is actually a requirement within risk management. As part of those controls, especially around CP controls, that contingency planning and whatsoever, you will find that there is a need to do that. If you say you come from IT shop and all your job is just to constantly check the network, ensure that there are security mechanisms from deploying firewall or whatsoever, guess what? It's all risk management. But because there are all of those SC controls around system and communications, that your entire job description is outlined there that an organization should be doing. So at this point, it becomes understanding where does your job role fit in within RMF, and then what terminology do they use to call it. You see, when you look at the entire RMF, and we will get in depth, there is the step 3 that requires you to implement. Implementation is the technical part, right? Where you're looking for engineers, developers, whatsoever to do the work. Now it becomes, how does what you do in the IT side of things align with step 3? Does it do all of step 3? I can tell you no, it doesn't. Not everybody will be able to cover all of those technical controls. A lot of us sysadmins that started as sysadmins, we have this idea of how to handle it, but it's very hard to find someone who is a very good network engineer, at the same time, a very good vulnerability assessor, and then a very good IAM person, right? So if all you know is like, say, Okta or Active Directory, guess what? You are doing step 3 of the RMF, because all of those AC controls and the IA controls around access control and identity and authentication, those are all implementing IAM solutions and configuring them. So it's really more of understanding the RMF step and the different requirements. If you come from law background, for example, and you think like, no, I don't have anything here, you actually do, because there are all of those managerial controls that requires one to drive all the -1 controls, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll see them, but all the -1 controls are policy related. They require you to write policies in place for how an organization is going to handle access management. So you would find technical people stuck at all -1 controls, but people from law background are able to instantly write what the policy should be. So I think it starts becoming identifying what your specialty is and where it sits within the entire RMF. And honestly speaking, if you want to have that discussion, I'm willing to take it offline with you, where you tell me exactly what you do and I will nail it, just like I'm telling you now from SC, AC, either at a control level or even taking your background to look into it. If you tell me, oh, I'm a medical doctor who really is now coming into it, how does RMF align with me? I will be able to tell you that if you're looking from RMF applicable to medical institutions, maybe looking at it from HIPAA, you might not see it within the framework, but the fact that as a medical person, you are able to speak in medical terms and say, listen, as a medical doctor or maybe as a nurse, the idea of you putting mechanisms in the system need to instantly in 1 minute be able to access because there is an emergency. You putting that is actually not helpful. Guess what you're doing? Risk management, because you are now architecting it, right? Where you start falling into those, selecting how the control should be as well as preparing it. So I think it's an overarching umbrella that everybody can find what fits them. Then there are the true risk professionals that their job is not to specialize in anything, but to understand it from end to end, which on my part, when I was learning, that's the approach I took. Instead of specializing on my tech, I come from an infrastructure, cloud, and network heavy background, not in application. But instead of focusing on those SC controls, I decided to learn RMF from end to end. But guess what? I'm still more conversant on the SC control. Does that make sense? I'll shut up now.
It makes great sense. And I would like to follow up with you, Dr. Ibrahim, sometime soon.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely would love to have the chat whenever you're ready. Just let me know, shoot me an email, and we can take it offline.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated, Doctor.
Sure, absolutely. We are 2 minutes over time. I believe I already said the closing letter, so I should not feel bad. But seriously, thank you so much, everyone. Always a pleasure doing this class, and I will see everybody next week. If anyone has anything that they wanted to connect, just as always, shoot me an email, text message, a pigeon, or whatever your means of communication is. So long as you don't appear on my screen, you're good. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, Doctor. Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.